Welcome everyone to this panel on tools for managing climate security risks. This is a panel that's put together with different papers looking at climate forecasting, and I'm gonna hear from 3 different papers. I'm just gonna put on a slide here from the organizers. Let's see if I can do that while waiting. There we go. Just read that and listen to me say something else at the same time. So as I said, we'll have 3 papers. We have 1.5 hours, so each paper will get about 17 to 20 minutes each. When there's about 3 minutes left, I'll interrupt and say 3 minutes, and that will probably be annoying, but I think that's easier than trying to wave hands. And then we'll do a Q&A after all 3 papers have been presented. If there are any questions for clarity or things like that, just raise your hand and then we can do it right away. For the Q&A, just raise your hand and we'll call you, or just leave the question in the chat and I'll read them out loud. Okay, so our first paper is by Lisa Binder, who's a research analyst at the PIK Future Lab, and Lukas Rüttinger, who's a senior advisor at Adelphi. The paper is called Weathering Risk, a Climate and Security Risk and Foresight Assessment. So please go ahead. Now unshare my screen.
Great, thank you very much. I'll share my screen. Once you stopped sharing yours. Yep. Great.
Like that.
Perfect. Perfect. So let me see. Can everybody see it? Yeah. Does it work? Okay, great. Yeah. So thank you much for the invitation. Yeah, as Siri said, we'll Lisa and I will present weathering risk, and I will start a bit with background on this initiative. It's a bit more than a paper, but it's kind of more an approach to methodology. And I'll present the general methodology and then hand over to Lisa to present the climate impact analysis that's part of our methodology. And then we'll both also present some of the results of our first pilot case study, which is on Mali. So weathering risk was launched in the summer of 2020 under the Berlin call to action by the German foreign minister. And it's a multilateral, multidisciplinary affair. And here you can see some of our excellent partners. And this initiative is led by Adelphi and PIK. And the overall kind of goals, well, there are like 3 interlinked goals for weathering risk. And one is to inform planning, and then to also enhance capacity and action on climate-related security risks. And we really have a very broad spectrum of target groups. So it starts out with policymakers, in particular foreign policymakers, but also extends to the broad community of practice around climate security risks. So those working to address climate and conflict risks, and in particular the UN system. And our objective with weathering risk is essentially to develop something that can be used to effect change on the ground to address climate security risks and to help us move from the talk to the walk and from analysis to action. And the first step of that is, of course, the assessment. So the first step is to ensure that local, national, and international kind of strategies, policies, and programming have access to and are better informed by evidence-based analysis on climate-related security risks. So this initiative is really seeks to improve our knowledge of how climate impacts and conflict risks interact in specific country or regional contexts, and what concrete actions can be taken to prevent or reduce these risks. How are we doing this? we're developing a replicable climate security risk and foresight assessment methodology that's looking at short, medium, and long-term risks to peace, prosperity, and well-being. So really broad on kind of like countries, conflict, and the overall stability, as well as geopolitical and diplomatic relationships, kind of like the international dimension of these kind of conflicts. And we're using a mixed method approach. So we combine state-of-the-art quantitative and qualitative assessment and scenario-based foresight methods in a really interesting and innovative way. And we're testing this methodology in a number of pilot assessments. And right now we're in the process where we're standing at the point where we have the version 1.0 of the weathering risk methodology developed. And we're currently starting with a pilot assessment. So the first assessment is on Mali, and here we're kind of in the last stage, kind of finalizing the analysis, and we're continuing with the Pacific and the MENA region. And we'll also do a continental assessment for Africa. So really taking a broad look at Africa as a whole. I will now present the analytical framework we are using, and I'll quickly walk you through it. And it has 5 key elements and covers the following areas. Oops, wrong direction. So the first is what we call the climate change lens. So where we focus on identifying the main climate impacts. So what are the main climate impacts and who is affected and how? And then we add the peace and security lens. So here we're really looking at kind of peace, instability, and conflict, and we're trying to understand existing and past drivers, dynamics, and actors of insecurity and conflict, and who is affected by conflict and insecurity. And then as a next step, we bring this together and we analyze the interactions between climate change, peace, and security. And it's important that we're not just kind of overlaying risks, but we're trying to understand specifically how climate change impacts certain conflict drivers. So how the impacts we have identified impact the drivers of insecurity and conflict that we've identified. And we're also trying to understand how conflict undermines the resilience to climate change. So how it kind of shapes vulnerability to climate change. And for that, we can use different prototypical pathways that we identified based on the state-of-the-art of climate security research. So those pathways include natural resource competition and conflicts, livelihood insecurity, migration displacement, also food insecurity, kind of international tensions around especially transboundary waters, as well as the unintended negative impacts that also climate change policies, as well as military and security policies and interventions can have. But these kind of pathways, we don't use them as kind of a straight jacket for our analysis, but just as a starting point. And then we kind of adapt them to every local context. So these pathways are our starting point, but then the way they play out is quite different. And when I come to the Mali example, that will become a bit clearer. And finally, we also look at a number of contextual factors shaping vulnerability and resilience. So these are factors that have been identified in research as being important in translating climate into conflict risks. And they include factors such as gender, equality, social inclusion, marginalization, social cohesion and relationships between groups, governance and trust in government, institutions for conflict management, and so on. This framework is really based on the state-of-the-art of conflict analysis, as well as kind of resilience and vulnerability assessments, and of course also the experience from environmental peace building and more general, and the kind of assessment frameworks that are developed there. And then also our experience and lessons learned in doing these kind of climate security assessment. And it really builds on what is out there. It's not all of these elements by themselves have been tried out before, so they're not new. They are created, they're combined in an interesting, innovative way, but they're not new in themselves. And that also makes this kind of framework accessible to a lot of actors that are maybe already working on climate change or conflict. In order for this to kind of be usable by a broad range of stakeholders, the approach is really flexible across different geographic scales, from kind of the local level to the national to the regional, and we'll also have it in different grades of complexity than that this can be implemented. And our approach consists of 5 main steps. So we use the best available quantitative climate change impact data, and Lisa will tell you a bit more about that in a second. And then we look at the peace and conflict context, and this is best done at the most granular levels. Where possible, we work with local partners and do a very localized context and conflict analysis through fieldwork, through interviews with as many affected groups as possible. And we really try to understand how different risks affect different groups. So men, women, elderly, disabled, different religious and livelihood groups, different age groups, and put a big effort in reaching those groups that are very marginalized and normally not included in these kind of assessment. This really lets us understand the kind of power dynamics and resilience factors that can compound or mediate climate security risks. So the third step is kind of looking forward, and here we're doing developing mainly narrative scenarios that can help us to prepare better for future risks and identify appropriate preventative actions. Then we have a machine learning part, and Sidney will have a whole presentation on that from our colleague Sidney. And then the final but perhaps most important step is to focus on identifying appropriate response measures that then address climate-related security risks. And with that, I'll hand over to Lisa. Over to you.
So thank you, Lukas, and a pleasure to be here also from my side. So yes, after having introduced the initiative and the different steps for assessing climate-related security risks within the methodology that Lukas just presented, we would now like to dive into the climate impact analysis, which forms this first step of our assessment approach. And Lukas, could you please click forward? So the goal of this step is to assess, thank you, projected climate changes and sectoral impacts ranging from today until 2080 in countries or regions where our assessment will be piloted. And assessed impacts will include information on including water availability, agriculture, but also on health and infrastructure impacts, as well as impacts on biodiversity. And the information that we gain from this climate impact analysis then feeds into the second step, namely the qualitative contextual analysis that Lukas also already touched upon. And to do the climate impact analysis, we draw on the data and modeling work done by the EasyMIP project from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. EasyMIP stands for the Intersectoral Impact Model Intercomparison Project. And it basically is a climate impact modeling community that provides data we draw on, and those data summarize climate change impacts now and in the future across existing models and also for different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. And in collaboration with the Agrica project at PIC, another project, we then generate country-specific climate risk profiles. Lukas, could you click forward, please? So our first pilot assessment, which we will launch soon, is focused on the Mali case, and Lukas will also go into this in more detail later on. And for this Mali case, we analyzed the climate impact information from the Agrica Climate Risk Profile Mali. And here you can see a map plot that provides you with regionally explicit information around the number of the annual number of very hot days on Mali. That is defined as days with a maximal annual surface temperature that is above 35 degrees. And it the map corresponds to approximately 50 times 15 kilometers for each grid cell that you can see there. So the leftmost column always provides you with the baseline period of the year 2000, and then the columns to the right show differences related to this baseline period for the years 2030, 50, and 80. And then on the y-axis, you can see the climate change projections shown for 2 different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. First one would be RCP 2.6, that is an emission scenario with more ambitious mitigation policies that are in line with the Paris Agreement. And the second one that you can see is RCP 6, with a scenario with a medium to high emission greenhouse gas emissions. So just to give you an example of what this climate impact analysis in the end will look like for those different countries that we are going to assess. And as we can see here on this plot, for example, for the Mali case, the number of very hot days is going to substantially increase, and that this increase will be affecting the south of Mali particularly strong, particularly under the high emission scenario. And given that southern Mali is a region with a quite high population density and growing immigration, the increasing temperature extremes will, of course, strongly affect also future living and working conditions of the populations there, and have also further implications on other sectors such as the health sector. Lukas, could you click? Yes. So, and I would just very briefly only show you an example of some other plots that we are producing on sectoral specific impacts. So these are projections of crop yields for some major crops grown in Mali, again, from the year 2000 to the year 2080 under those 2 greenhouse gas emission scenarios that I already mentioned. So this blue line represents the scenario, the lower emission scenario, and the red line, the higher emission scenario. And I won't go into much detail, but as you can see from those 2 plots, at least maize and sorghum are projected to decrease in the future. And given that people in Mali are highly reliant on the agricultural sector, which contributes to around half of the country's GDP, also climate-related changes might, of course, strongly impact future food security. And we also provide for selected numbers of crops this especially in explicit way.
We have about 3 minutes.
Oh, okay. So just this is a very brief summary of the major results of future climate change impacts in Mali. What we will definitely see within the years and decades to come are strong temperature increase across the country and the rise in the number of very hot days, as I showed, that will translate into increased exposure to heat waves and heat-related mortalities. Lukas, please click. And then there are projections that are a little less certain, but I think it's still important to recognize that uncertainties are an integral part of climate change projections, and they still, of course, give us some value. And as we can see from the projections for Mali, we are experiencing high interannual precipitation variabilities currently that are causing droughts and flooding, and it's difficult to discern a clear future precipitation trends, which also then translates into some levels of uncertainties in relation to crop yields, GDP exposure, or impacts on biodiversity. But what we will definitely see is that population growth, if we calculate it into future water projections, you can click, Lukas, please, is expected to strongly decrease, given that Mali's population is expected to double by 2035. Okay, I think you can take over now. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Siri, I might need a minute more to run through this, but I'll be as quick as possible. So maybe lastly, we want to share some preliminary results from how this goes then together with the kind of conflict analysis. So when you hear experts talking about climate change in Mali, it's often about increased desertification, expanding Sahara, resource scarcity, and that then leading to more natural resource conflicts, especially farmer-herder conflicts. But what we found is that it's actually a bit more complex than that. Like, so from the climate side, we just heard that it's a lot about increasing variability that people are already experiencing now, and then how to address kind of the uncertainty in the future. And from a climate security side, we see 4 main climate security risks. So the first one is that climate change and conflict have led to significant livelihood changes and have hindered adaptation. So in general, climate and conflict have undermined the resilience of many population groups and are leading to decreasing social cohesion, more competition, and less cooperation. And that's ultimately exacerbating existing conflict dynamics. So for example, a lot of groups are actually diversifying their livelihood. So farmers taking up livestock and also fishing. But that in itself is a good adaptation strategy. It also leads to less exchange and kind of trade between groups and to more competition over these other resources, especially fishing. The second climate security risk we identify is rent-seeking, corrupt, and conflict-insensitive behavior by the government and traditional authorities. And that's really constraining climate change adaptation. It's really driving grievances and contributing to ineffective conflict resolution. And that's particularly the case around natural resources, where government and traditional authorities, for example, take bribes for access to natural resources, such as forests. And that behavior then leads to more environmental degradation because resources are overused, decreasing resilience, and also additional conflicts. And even more importantly, it also further weakens the relationship between population groups and the government. And jihadi armed opposition groups that are very prevalent in Mali and part of the conflict are actively exploiting these grievances to strengthen their own legitimacy and recruit new members. Then climate change is also one of the factors leading to rising competition over natural resources and natural resource conflicts, but they're not just between pastoralists and farmers, but also within these groups, so pastoralists against pastoralists, farmers against farmers, but also other groups like, for example, fishers. And then lastly, inequality is really a key driver of climate insecurity, and the combined impacts of climate change and conflict and the climate security risks I just talked about are widening already existing inequalities. And this creates kind of a vicious cycle of increasing climate insecurity, conflict, and inequality. And it particularly, groups that are already vulnerable are the most impacted by these dynamics. So kind of displaced people, women, and young people. So what do we need to do? Just very, very quickly, one of the most effective and no regret strategies to address these kind of compound risks is to rebuild social cohesion at 3 levels. One, between people and the state, so that the state can help and not hinder adaptation to climate change. Between and within communities, for example, fostering natural resource management that is equitable and inclusive, between generations and genders, so that compound climate and insecurity factors don't make life worse for those who are already the most marginalized. And then lastly, and very importantly, the international community and the state need to move beyond the very militarized approaches to really build resilience against compound climate security risks, especially in southern Mali, which is also, as Lisa said, projected to be more impacted in the future. With that, I would like to finish. Sorry for going a bit longer. Back over to you, Siri.
Thank you. That's fine. I see there's already questions coming in the chat, but as I said, we'll take them at the end, so you can have a peek at them and prepare a really good answer. So the next paper is by Paola Vesco, who is a postdoc researcher at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research in Uppsala. Her paper is called A Climate of War or Peace, Testing the Effect of Drought on Conflict Dynamics. So go ahead, Paola.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I will share my screen. Can you see the slides? Yes, great. I'll pause my video. Okay. Shout out loud if something goes wrong, because I am not looking at you, so you can tell me if you don't see the slides. So today I'm happy to present this paper that is titled "The Climate of War or Peace," and it's part of the VIEWS project at Uppsala University. VIEWS is a violence early warning system that forecasts the risk of conflict, of political violence in Africa, and we're also expanding to the Middle East now. I'm planning to reach the global coverage in the next few years. So here, the main goal of the study of the paper are to study the influence of droughts and especially the interaction effect of droughts and agricultural production on conflict escalation. I do so at the subnational level, and especially by using gridded data, the so-called PRIO-grid resolution that is 0.5 by 0.5 degrees resolution, so more or less covering an area of 55 kilometers at the equator. And I look at Africa, the whole African continent for the period 1990 up to 2020. And the main goal of the paper is to test the power of droughts and agricultural production in forecasting escalation of state-based violence in and out of sample settings. We know from the past literature that changes in climate and in natural extremes may raise the likelihood of armed conflict. I've already raised the risk of conflict, although indirectly and conditionally on many factors, and are even more likely to increase the armed conflict onset and incidence in the future, because natural extremes and changes in climate are projected to increase in frequency and severity in the future. So far, though, very limited attention has been devoted to the effect of climate on conflict dynamics, and especially on conflict escalation. And this is an important gap, because the mechanisms that we know are linking climate change and natural extremes to conflict onset or incidence may be different than those that relate to conflict dynamics and escalation. So we need to understand better how climate variability and natural extremes are connected to the escalation of violence. And this carries not only academic relevance, but also policy relevance, because we know that conflicts are likely to reoccur when they start, and they may even lead to conflict traps, where conflicts reoccur. And so being able to predict when and where fatalities related to violence and political violence specifically are likely to happen is extremely crucial. There is surprisingly limited knowledge of this, not only the effect that climate has on escalation, but also more broadly on the drivers of conflict escalation. And the existing research suffers from some limitation, specifically related to the way that these studies operationalize the dependent variable. Although agreeing on change, specifically change over time in the intensity of conflict, being an important dimension of escalation, these studies tend to neglect the dimension of change when they operationalize the dependent variable. And there are also more broader challenges related to the empirical strategies. We all know about the limitations of the p-values and the statistical significance hypothesis testing. And we also know that forecasting tools and recent progress in data availability and machine learning can help overcoming these limitations. There is, to the best of my knowledge, only a recent study by Linke et al. Published in 2022 that used this machine learning driven forecasting tools to predict, to test the effect of climate variability in predicting conflict at a subnational level. But this study doesn't really focus on agricultural production, and also the dependent variable is not escalation. So the contribution that I think my paper brings to the literatures are different. First, I contribute to the literature on climate security by exploring a neglected dimension of the outcome, and specifically the effect that droughts and agricultural production lead to conflict escalation at the subnational level. I also contribute to the field of conflict dynamics and escalation by suggesting a new and simple operationalization of the dependent variable that can help overcome some of the pre-existing challenges. And finally, I contribute to the literature on conflict forecasts by applying machine learning driven tools that can validate theoretical arguments. There hasn't been one of the few papers studying the effect of studying the drivers of conflict escalation. Has been published by Blair and Sambanis in 2020, and what they find by using this forecasting by using these machine learning tools to predict the escalation of violence is that procedural models that rely on and that closely represent the dynamics of mobilization and dissent perform much better in predicting escalation than structural models that instead rely on slow-moving features. And we may argue that climate shocks and natural extremes such as droughts can represent an important component of these procedural models to the extent that they reflect the negative impacts. They reflect more closely the incentives and opportunities of the actors to mobilize. The negative impacts of droughts on agriculture, especially increase food insecurity, they damage local livelihoods, they disrupt the agricultural labor market, and in turn, the destabilizing impacts that climate extremes have, especially on agriculture-dependent regions, can change and shape conflict actors' incentives and opportunities to act. For example, governments can see a window of opportunity in the deprivation induced by droughts and use it and take advantage of this to intensify their repression. This is, for example, the case in the Ethiopian war when the government exploited the funds that it received to counter the famine. Also, food and water insecurity and shortages represent immediate grievances in the definition of Gustafsson 2020, in the sense that they call for an immediate action by the government, unlike grievances that are more long-term and connected, for example, to self-autonomy. These grievances request an immediate action from the government, and if they're not, the concessions are not met, they can intensify violent behaviors. And finally, combatants' recruiting strategies may become even more appealing in the aftermath of a drought and crop failures, because rebel leaders rely on the provision of food and shelter to civilians, and so their appeal may even be stronger in the aftermath of a drought. So this leads me to formulate two main testable implications. The first one is that forecasting models, and specifically out-of-sample forecasting models, in this case, that include indicators of drought, improve predictions of conflict escalation compared with a baseline model. And second hypothesis is that forecasting models that include both droughts and agricultural production indicators improve predictions of conflict escalation compared to both models. To test these implications, I use a set of different model specifications. A baseline model that is a very simple model that includes what we know are the best predictors of conflict dynamics and representing both the structural component and the procedural component. So I include features that indicate the past trends in violence and also the distance to ongoing violence, because we know that violence is also likely to spill over from neighboring locations. I include population size, GDP, and proxy of development, because these are well-known structural features that are particularly useful to predict on the longer term. And on top of these baseline features, I add drought features in the first model. only indicators of drought. And in the second model specification, I also include agriculture-related features. And I test and compare the performance of these models by means of a bootstrapping to also account for the uncertainty in the error. The main drought predictors are based on the SPEI index, that is a well-known measure of droughts, and also has the advantage that it enables me to assess the impact of droughts on different time scales, because the SPEI can be computed for different time scales that also consider different impacts on hydrological systems. So I include SPEI for different time scales, for example, SPEI 3 and SPEI 48. I also include some, as for the agriculture features, I include variables representing the growing season of the local crops from Mirka, and the share of harvested area and the yields from MapSpam. And finally, to account for the fact that communities and locations that have been subject to very high climate variability in the past may be more prone and more likely to adapt to future climate shocks, I also include some information about the past climate variability to proxy for this adaptive capacity. The forecasting models rely on the setup of views. As I said, I won't go in detail about that. I'm happy to answer questions if you have. So I call every model specification, the 3 different model specifications as model, and I produce forecasts for different step ahead. Step in my notation is the month for which the forecast is produced. And this has relevant implications for the dependent variable, as we will see. I divide the data into 3 main sets: the training, calibration, and the true forecast, or in my case, since I'm using an out of sample setting, is the test set. And all the models rely on random forest. So the main outcome that I'm predicting is the temporal change in the logged number of fatalities from state-based violence. State-based violence is defined according to UCDP, GET definition and data, and the spatial resolution, as I said, is the PRIO grid, so the grid cell. This step convention that I use and the fact that I predict for different months ahead also enables me to define the dependent variable in the way that you see here in the formula. So where Y is the number of fatalities, and I compare the change in the log number of fatalities in T versus T minus S, where S corresponds to the months. So for example, if I can define delta 3 for March 2018, that would be the change in fatalities in the log number of fatalities in March 2018 compared to 3 months before. And since I can do this for different months or steps, this definition of the dependent variable enables me to assess and evaluate different temporal trends, both in the short term and in the longer term. I predict up to 36 months into the future. This formulation also has other advantages, such as the fact that I can forecast multiplicative change, because in the logged scale, a change from 100 to 150 is seen as commensurate to one from 1,000 to 1,500.
You have about 3 minutes left.
Thanks. So the results of the models are presented here for June 2018. The first on the left is the baseline, and then you see the models including drought indicators. The predictions are quite similar, and the models do quite a good job in identifying the locations where we observed a change in fatalities. Red is an upward change in fatalities, and blue is a downward change. But it's clear from the maps that the models including drought indicators provide less sharp predictions. because the amount of blue and red cells is higher, although these cells should be white because they didn't experience any violence change. There are also a tendency of the drought models to predict a more diffuse and generalized escalation of violence in the regions that experienced a drought in the preceding months. And this is quite interesting, especially because the agricultural model, so the model that also includes agricultural indicators, exhibits even a larger, although of course moderately because the predictions are similar, a larger tendency to predict an increase in fatalities. For example, this is evident in the Lake Chad region, but also in some parts of Somalia and South Sudan. As for the ability of the models to capture trends, you see on the top row presents the actual observed trends in fatalities for the period 2017 to 2020. And then I tried to plot the prediction from the drought model that also includes agricultural features. The continuous line presents the short-term trend, and the dashed line is the longer-term trend. And you see that the models tend to predict a plateauing of the model. In this case tends to predict like a flattening of the curve after a peak in fatalities. This is very evident in all models, especially in central Mali, where the model completely missed the peak in fatalities in the end of 2019. As expected from these results so far, I see that the feature importances, I use a permutation importance, assigns a low importance to drought-related features. A higher importance is assigned to agricultural features, but it's quite interesting when we compare the drought features in the training and the test set. We see that the model assigns a much higher importance to these features, to the climate features on the training set, than the true importance assigned in the test set. And this is an indication of overfitting, and also explains why the drought models perform quite poorly. So what I find when I compare the performance or the mean squared error, and I use bootstrapping here, is that the models including drought indicators perform worse, consistently worse than the baseline model. And so to conclude, the results of both the feature importance, the maps, and the time trends, and also mainly the performance evaluation suggest that the drought and agriculture indicators do not have a high contribution and are poor predictors of conflict escalation when compared with information on past conflict trends and more structural factors. And this is consistent with the study I mentioned before that also finds that climate variability performs poorly when predicting conflict, but also we need to exert caution when interpreting these results, in the sense that this does not imply that drought indicators have no relevance at all in predicting conflict dynamics, but we need to investigate more the importance of drought in predicting other types of violence, for example, less intense conflict events. And we need also to understand better the role of conflict actors in shaping the effect of climate extremes, and potentially also the violence spillovers that might be induced by droughts. Thank you very much, and sorry for being a bit late. I stopped sharing.
Thank you, Paola. That was excellent. See there are questions coming in, so if you have questions for Paola, just post them in the chat and we'll get back to them. So the final paper is by Sidney Michelini, who's a PhD student at the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact. And his paper is called Using Machine Learning to Improve Conflict Prediction in a Changing Climate. So please go ahead.
Yeah, can you all hear me, /see me, we're all good? Perfect. So hello, everyone, and thanks for being here this early morning in Alabama. I keep telling my best friend that I'm sick of doing this time change, think I'm going to be a flat earther. And she keeps telling me that's not how that works. And so, yeah, I am stuck giving you presentations at 4:45 in the morning, but I am actually really excited to be here. I've been loving this conference. So as you can see by this title slide, my name is Sidney Michelini, and I'm going to present the first results from my PhD project on the relationship between climate change and conflicts. The reason the left side of your screen, taken up by this dramatic and hopefully familiar natural image, is that I work with Lisa and the team at Adelphi on weathering risk that you all hopefully now know something about. Also, for any PIC or Adelphi people out there who have already heard me present this work before, the research has been recently updated. The jokes have not, and I'm sorry in advance. So now the specific research project I'm discussing today stems out of a more modest but equally important extension to the weathering risk agenda. One of the major projects of my department and PIC more generally is called the ISIMAP project, which aggregates and produces climatic data. And we wanted to know, can high quality climate impact data be useful in improving conflict predictions compared to other forecasts? This is a similar question to the one that we just saw, but it does differ in a few specific ways. And I was crossing my fingers the entire time, hoping we had somewhat similar results. Otherwise, we were going to have to dig into them. And we do. The professor who taught my final undergraduate seminar used to joke that economists don't like suspense, so we put our conclusions at the beginning. And while this makes for a terrible rhetorical strategy, I do need to actually show you some of the results so that you have some idea of what it is that I'm trying to demonstrate throughout this presentation. And this sets me up for yet another economist joke, because the answer to this seemingly straightforward question is it depends. I will get into a little bit more about what this means as we go along, but the 30,000-foot view of this is that climate impact data has useful information for predicting conflict, but that information is also contained in several other indicators, and thus it's not adding marginal information to my model. Perfect. So before continuing, I want to briefly explain why it is that we are willing to spend significant parts of the best years of our life, as well as a fair bit of public money, to answer this question. And the central aim of this broader literature on conflict prediction is something called early warning and early action. And the central idea here, going back to major US government projects in the early Cold War era, is that conflict works something like cancer. It's really bad, but the earlier we catch the signs and intervene, the better it is. And this sounds great, but there's no reason to identify a disease early if you have no meaningful treatment, which is why the second goal of this research is to gain some insight into the underlying processes that lead to conflict and find a way to disrupt them. Behind the scenes, there's this large debate that goes all the way down to the underlying framework we use to extract knowledge from data. Most of the time, economists like me use econometric techniques, which are really just inference techniques for economists, focused on causal inference that relies on finding either artificial or natural sources of random variation to try to understand causal relationships. The hope is that we can combine a number of well-identified causal relationships together to get a working understanding of a phenomenon that we can then use to build policy. A randomized trial is a textbook example of this. However, a number of scholars working on conflict predictions argue that this approach is unlikely to give us the information we need to deal with conflict, and thus we should also look to forecasting to improve our understanding of conflict dynamics. For reasons I'm happy to talk about at the end, these approaches are not mutually exclusive and can be molded together into a future research project that I'm actually working on right now. Just to clarify these remarks, I'm not challenging the validity of this dominant focus on causation. What I am saying is that in peace studies, there's an excellent article by Halvard Heger that lays this out. Forecasting holds an equally important place at present and historically. All right, quick presentation footnote. Large N studies, that means studies with large amounts of data where you throw algorithms at them. Climate and conflict, whether causal or predictive, tend to take a positivist framework. In practice, this tends to lead to a dynamic where the researcher, that's me, tries to stand at a distance above the subject and deliver some objective, apolitical, or dispassionate conclusions. Under the best of cases, this is problematic. And when the researcher is an American living in Germany, writing about sub-Saharan Africa, a region he has only visited once for reasons that, thank God, were not related to conflict, it becomes pretty clear that I might miss a lot of things and that my research might have political effects or be written or sort of imply something politically that I hadn't thought about. And we should not lose sight of the fact that organized violence almost always has a political dimension. And the fact that I can predict it reasonably well with variables that seem far from the exercise of power should not obscure that fact in any way. Second, we should always be cognizant of the broader discourse our research enters and be careful not to do harm with it. It'll become a bit more clear what I mean when I interpret my results, but just keep that in mind, that I am aware of that as I'm doing sort of a more quantitative approach. And having highlighted the two goals of this research community, we can also visualize the different types of knowledge they might create. So the first would be a model that allows us to understand the conditions that lead to conflict and would look something like this one. It's externally valid, easily replicable, policy relevant, but also probably impossible to obtain. Human life is just not that simple. So instead, we are left with knowledge that looks something like this, or like some of the things I will show you today. These contain evidence of certain causal and predictive relationships under certain conditions, which we can use to make better policies. It's not ideal, but it might move us forward. All right, as I referenced before, there is a community of researchers working on conflict prediction, as you learned today, because two of us have talked to you about conflict prediction. And this slide contains one-sentence versions of general conclusions that took us quite a bit of research to discover. First, having a history of conflict is a strong predictor of future conflicts. I call this the inertia property of conflict, whereby places in conflict tend to stay in conflict and places at peace tend to stay at peace. My mother calls this relatively obvious. There's also been some work to show that adding more variables and using more complex models increases predictive power to some extent. I think a bit more interesting is that conflict prediction tends to look like a big data problem because there's a lot of observations. However, there are actually not that many conflicts, thank God, and even fewer conflict onsets, new conflicts, which means that we have to think of it as a small data problem. Hannes Muller calls this dynamic the hard problem of conflict prediction because it's quite easy to build good forecasts of conflict instance, the existence of conflict, which I will teach you due to the large number of easily identified places at peace. All right, and now we can take this broader literature and move forward towards answering our original question. Remember, we want to know if climate impact data is useful for improving conflict predictions. This slide has a lot of information, but I want to make sure we have a broad outline of our strategy before continuing. First, we're going to use a random forest. I'll discuss how that works in another slide. Let's generate predictions for instances of conflicts. This will look like having a probability of having a conflict in a given location in a given year. We will generate these forecasts using all different combinations of our input variables. We want to know, for example, how good predictions generated using disasters and previous conflicts are compared to just disasters or just previous conflicts. This sort of additive dynamic where you can sort of have four groups and you can just put them together and sort of see if X combined with Y in a model leads to more or less overall prediction is the central sort of essence of the project. And then step 3 allows us to address some of the challenges we observed on the previous slide by splitting the data into 2 groups, those with a history of conflict and those with a history of peace. We can see how good our model is at predicting conflict onsets and continuing conflicts. Right. A great empirical strategy is almost definitionally useless without good data. Luckily, there is quite a bit of constantly improving data out there on conflict and climate. As I mentioned in the previous slide, we have 4 general categories of indicators. The first is previous conflict. For both our output and input variables, we use conflict instances, whether there is a conflict. First off, I have to tell you, I only have data going back far enough for Africa. I sincerely apologize. My next project sort of is worldwide, but I wanted to be able to use both ACLID and UCDP data, which are the 2 major sources, and I wanted to be able to show that sort of what I'm going to demonstrate to you is in fact true for both of them. I have hope that my future work will cover larger areas, but for now, it's mainly Africa. Second, the unit of analysis is the subnational level. These are administrative level units. The size and name of each of them varies wildly depending on country, but think province, county, city, neighborhood, etc. We took the second lowest level as our lowest level because the lowest only exists in mainland Africa for Burundi, and I didn't want to skew the data set too much. There are 2 main sources of geo-referenced conflict data, as I told you, in the world, and they are ACLID, the Armed Conflict Location Events Database, and UCDP, which is from Uppsala. So thanks, guys. These are actually really useful. Their differences are mainly in what they code as an event. UCDP only codes battles, and ACLID has battles, riots, and protests, and other types of violence. In the presentation, I'm going to show you accolade battles primarily, but you will see the others in the background as a demonstration that they actually do tell me the same story in this case. All right, climate impact data, or as I call it in this presentation, the specific things are extreme weather event data, because we do sort of want to start to draw a stronger divide between what is climate change and what is sort of extreme weather events, comes from our very own EasyMap project at PIC. Droughts are measured as the number of months in a year that go below the 10th percentile of soil moisture. Floods has two indicators, both was there a flood and was there a 100-year flood or a terrible flood. And finally, tropical cyclones include coverage of 34, 64, and 96 not tropical cyclones. IDMC is internally displaced people. They keep data on disasters and conflict-related displacement, so we split it between conflict and climate impacts. Our socioeconomic indicators come from a number of sources that I'm happy to talk or share. They're things like GDP, land use, infant mortality rate, everything you can imagine I've thrown into this. And all of them are at the grid cell level mainly. And finally, our governance indicators are the world governance indicators, the rule of law, control of corruption, peace and security, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, and voice and accountability. All right, so as we transition to discussing the actual forest generation, we need to take a second to talk about what a decision tree is. Luckily, I've already showed you one when we talked about the types of knowledge we are hoping to generate. There's another simple example here on the left. Essentially, decision trees are made by optimally splitting the data set into two groups continuously, and the outcome is easy to read and use. However, if the data changes even slightly, the tree can be entirely different. And this poses a problem for generating conclusions that are externally valid and replicable. The solution to this problem is called a random forest. As the name suggests, the random forest is just a large number of decision trees. However, the GRF package, which we use, gives us a few nice properties. Each tree is trained on half the data set and used to project onto the other half. So essentially we have 2000-fold cross-validation, and we don't need a training set or a test set to estimate how good our predictors are. The algorithm is also specifically designed to prevent overfitting in ways that I can talk about in discussion if anyone is interested. The key problem with a random forest is that it is much harder to interpret than a decision tree. However, for our purposes, the results are the most important part, and we're able to visualize them, and I'll show you that in a minute, so it's okay. All right, now this random forest will split out continuous predictions, which means things on a scale of 0 to 1 for binary outcomes. And we will use two methods to evaluate these predictions: the receiver operating characteristic, the ROC curve, and precision recall curves, PR curves. The ROC curves, as shown above, these lovely things. As you can see, the curves graph the trade-off between true positive rates and false positives at different thresholds used to convert continuous predictions to binary predictions. So if I have continuous predictions, I select a large number of thresholds, and at each of them, I plot the difference, or sort of the true positive rate and the false positive rate. And then it gives me this curve. The area under this curve is going to be the metric I use. In concrete terms, a 1 is perfect. That means there's no trade-off. 0.5 is the guessing rate, and 0 is truly abysmal. Precision recall curves work the exact same way, except for that they graph the fraction of predicted conflicts that are actual conflicts against the fraction of actual conflicts that we predicted. Like the ROC curves, we take the AUC, the area under that curve, as our metric of how well the algorithm did. The main difference between PR and ROC curves is that ROC curves focus on classifying peace and conflict, while PR curves ask how well we did at catching conflicts. Remember that conflicts are kind of rare, thank God. They happen in about 1% of our most granular, at the most smallest administrative data set. So we report both to ensure that our findings are robust. And now, a moment of truth, voila. So now that we have the tools, we can look at the results.
You have about 3 minutes left.
Yep. The graph on the left is the PR curve, and the graph on the right is the ROC curve. From left to right, we go from the national level to the most granular administrative level. So it's something like national level, sort of province or autonomous community, et cetera, and then sort of you go down. The bold lines are for accolade battles, and the rest are a bit more opaque. This is purely to make the graphs easier to read. They basically tell the same story. As you can see, there's a slight upward trend in the ROC curves and a downward trend in PR curves. This likely comes from the different percentage of positive cases, places in conflict at different administrative levels. What is interesting to us is the relative performance of each of the indicators. On this front, there are two key takeaways from this graph. The first is that extreme events have some predictive power for future conflict, but less so that well-known groupings, less so than well-known groupings such as socioeconomic indicators and governance. The second is extreme events perform better than conflict history at the most granular administrative level. As far as we know, the rapid reduction in the power of previous conflict to predict future conflict at the most granular administrative levels is a new result. What we are seeing is that extreme event data is more valuable than conflict history at the most granular administrative level, which is unusual. However, interesting this may be, we're not just interested in horse race predictions between groupings of indicators. We want to know if there's any unique information contained in extreme events. And to this extent, we combine extreme weather events with each of the other indicator groups to see whether it improves upon conflict forecasts. And we find the answer is no. Extreme events do not add predictive information to conflict history and governance. They do, but critically, they do not add information to socioeconomic indicators. And given that, it will not surprise you to learn that they also don't add information to all of the other indicators combined. While it might seem like this comes from a high correlation between extreme events and socioeconomic indicators, we dug into it and we're digging into it. This does not appear yet to be the case. The correlations are not high, and this makes sense because our extreme events data comes from products that are designed to be exogenous. And thus, we are left with the idea that extreme events do not add any new predictors, which brings me here. And thus, we're left trying to understand this somewhat odd result may mean about the data generating process. First, we know that most things we tried had some predictive power. This is good news because we want better forecasts. However, it also demonstrates that we will not get positive results from a lot of different attempts to predict conflict. This is important for the field as a whole, but not the original question. When trying to find out if disasters predict conflict, it turns out they do surprisingly well. Remember, natural disasters, extreme events are rare. We would not expect them to predict conflict very well because they do not happen very often. The fact that they do is a positive result. However, when compared to forecasts with all other variables, extreme weather events did not improve upon current predictive groups. So put differently, I am concurring with Paola that they seem to have no additional information about conflicts. And I'm out of time, so I won't add speculations because this isn't a presentation. So thank you very much. And now we can all happily take questions and I can answer anything you'd like to know.
Thank you. Thanks for 3 great presentations. And we already have questions for all of you. So we have about 25 minutes for questions. So I'll start off with 2 questions for Lukas and Lisa. They're all in the chat, so you can have a look at them. My question, this is from Marie Schellis. My question for the contextual analysis, how far do you go back in history? You say the overall methodology focus on short, medium, and long-term risk into the future, I assume. At the same time, we know historical context is so important. At the same time, you can get lost in historical context analysis and keep going further back in time. Do you have any guidance on how to deal with historical analysis for climate security assessment? And then a second question from Harris. Excuse me. Can we also consider relocation migration as one of the solution factors to avoid climate-induced conflict? So Lisa and Lukas, do you have any answers to these?
Yeah, do you want me to go first or do you? Sure. Okay. Yeah, so maybe just before I start, and I think it's interesting that we come back to the history of conflict, like across questions for both the qualitative and qualitative assessment, kind of the presentations we just had, which I find interesting, which also confirms a bit that the kind of machine learning quantitative analysis that is being done at the moment kind of confirms the overall finding both in qualitative and quantitative research that the link between climate change and conflict is not direct, but it's kind of, it's going through a number of really, really important context factors, kind of like the socioeconomic factors, the social cohesion, governance, and the history of conflict. And that's also where we try to dig in with our contextual analysis into these context factors because they are so important. And they're also so hard to kind of look at also on the quantitative side, but even for governance and stuff like that, like the data is not great, especially on its subnational level. So if you look into that. So thanks for the question on how to do kind of like, how far do you have to go with a history of conflict analysis if you do a context analysis? And For Mali, we went back quite a bit, but maybe like the further you go back, maybe the less granular you have to be, and the closer you come to the future, the more, especially if you look at the history of conflict, you have to be. So you have to understand where is the conflict kind of coming from that you're looking at. And in Mali, that's really a long kind of history of secession movements in the north, and then more recently, kind of like conflict spillover from Libya, like the rise of jihadi groups in West Africa in general, but also globally. So you need to understand that. And then that's kind of the conflict history, but you also at the same time need to understand maybe what I could call like the history of livelihoods. So kind of like for Mali, it was also extremely important for us to understand kind of the longer history in kind of like how climate and weather affected livelihoods. For example, you had in the 70s and 80s long-lasting droughts that kind of like created certain movements of people, and that people are still remembering, and that kind of like play into dynamics also today, kind of like the longer history of how the marginalization of certain livelihoods groups is actually pastoralist. So you kind of have to bring that together. So kind of for Mali, we went back to the 70s and 80s at least to kind of understand that, but like kind of not on the most granular level, and then become more granular as we move forward through the historical analysis. And of course, Maria, as you said, like it's important to not get lost in this history of conflict, but kind of like get enough information to understand the conflict dynamics and the conflict actors and how they are behaving today. Then the question on relocation and migration. I mean, it's a really big question, but I think in general, of course, it's always important to underline that migration is a very effective and important adaptation strategy to climate change, and has been for thousands of years. But it can be more or less effective. So I kind of like, there's one thing is like how forced is the movement of people. So kind of like if we look at conflict context, there's a lot of displacement, both because of extreme weather events and because of conflict. And that often kind of creates problems in receiving areas with more pressure on natural resources and kind of like new conflicts and kind of grievances. And maybe the more planned movements of people can be a bit less conflictive, or like they're often also slower. And there's a lot of ways, and oh no, maybe one other thing I want to talk about is also what we can see is the effect of climate change on rural urban migration, which is super important, and which is like one of those long-term trends that we can see that often also accelerates in times of conflict, so that we can see that there's a lot of movement from countryside into cities, and that we have then increases the pressure in cities on kind of services, on livelihoods, on work. And all of that underlines the need to manage these kind of movements more proactively, to make them, to make it possible that they continue to be adaptation strategies. So one example is that, for example, when people move from the countryside to the city, it can be because they're moving out of a very climate vulnerable area in the countryside. But then when they move into the cities, they also tend to settle in more informal areas where they might be just as vulnerable to climate impacts as where they've come before. So it's really important to kind of like manage this in a proactive way. And then one last point on relocation, because I think that's very specific kind of migration and movement. And it's not so much in the African context yet, but we're also working a lot in the Pacific, and there it's much more prevalent. So it's already happening, and it's much more part of the discussion of kind of like how to deal with sea level rise and with like areas that become increasingly uninhabitable. That doesn't mean that that won't be also for many parts of Africa an important topic, but I mean, it's a different scale. And what we can see is that where relocation happens, it is very, very conflicted. So it's very hard to do, especially for governments to kind of manage the process in a peaceful way, to provide livelihoods, to provide infrastructure for people who are moving. It's very hard to do. And because of that, like kind of from a technical reason, but also from a cultural perspective and what land means for people and home, it should really be the last resort. So kind of like you need to kind of look into any other adaptation strategy before you start relocating people, because that can really be the last resort. And with that, like I would hand it over to you, Lisa, to add.
Thanks. I think your replies to both questions were already quite holistic, and I have not much to add on to that. On the contextual analysis, as Lukas said, I think all in all, it's always quite context specific to look into which history of conflicts is there and how does this relate to the climate impact information that basically stated to unfold within the last decades. So this would also be like something very important to look into from the conflict side, from the climate side. And then in terms of the question on relocation and migration, I just wanted to say that indeed, or point to the fact again, that indeed migration can be a part or an effective adaptation strategy. And we have actually also, I mean, we see this in Mali, where for decades and centuries, circular migration was something that was very, very common, and people adapted to changes in climate and also to conflict situations. But as Lukas said, what we are seeing is this increased urbanization that is putting additional pressure right now on natural resources and on, for example, the infrastructure and so on. And therefore, I think this is something where we would need to look into and see how we can make this become more manageable and be prepared for migration inflows.
Okay, thank you, Lisa and Lukas. Then there's a couple of questions for Paola. Marie is asking, why do you split up your training, calibration and testing data along different time periods? What is the effect of your model results if these are different conflict dynamics throughout those periods? Also, what is the difference between training and calibration data? And then Tobias is asking about disaster data, perhaps include the data on this would improve the model. Also, have you considered drought impact on conflict de-escalation? I know you responded in the chat, but maybe you can just sort of give a recap for the rest of us as well.
Yes, I responded because I thought maybe we don't have time to go through all the questions. So yeah, but I'm happy to elaborate. So Marie, thanks for your question. Also, I had a look at the project that you mentioned. It's very interesting. Yeah, I split in the training, calibration, and test by using year cutoffs, because this avoids the risk of data leakage. There has been a lot of discussion recently on data leakage, and especially when we're trying to predict something as conflict that has such a clear trend over time. There's a possibility that if we don't use year cutoffs and, for example, split the training and test randomly, we introduce data leakage. And also because of the time shifting process that I'm using in views, meaning very basically that I predict 1 month ahead by using data. For example, I predict March 2018 by using data up to February 2018. If I didn't introduce the year cutoff to split the training and test, I theoretically can end up in a situation where I use future information on the conflict in my predictions. So this is what I mean when I say that I try to avoid data leakage. And as for the calibration, that's a good point. I do calibration because I use downsampling. Maybe it's not necessary all the time, but because I'm using grid cell level data, the training is very slow, especially because I'm predicting at the monthly level too. And so I use downsampling, meaning that I artificially drop some of the observations where I have no conflict because the dataset is very imbalanced. And so after downsampling, you have to calibrate because the distribution of your predicted outcome needs to match, or we want it to match the actual values. And so I have to find another set for calibration. I know some people use the same training and calibration set. And the question on conflict dynamics, yes, I find that different dynamics have an impact. Of course, in the prediction, I can say that because it's assigned quite high importance by the permutation importances, both on the training and the test set, and for different time horizons. And I also tested. You may wonder if these pre-existing dynamics may change the predictions, and to test this, I also run some robustness tests by subsetting the sample. I basically rerun all the models only for the grid cells that experienced conflict, at least one fatality per month. And I find that the results do not change. Yes, I hope I understood your questions correctly. And Tobias, thank you. Thank you very much. This is a great point. And I think I can just say, if you have this data, please contact me. I will be very interested to include it. I'm not aware of this data for this time period that I'm interested in, from 1990 up to 2020. And it needs to be time varying to be useful for predictions, and cover the whole continent and be gridded or subnational at least. So I'm not aware of this data with these requirements being available, but it would be extremely interested. Yes, I know Afrobarometer has some data, but I'm not aware of governance, disaster-related impact on governance, but I may be wrong. Tobias, I don't know, Siri, is it okay if he answers? Thanks.
Thank you. That's perfect. Then there's some questions for Sidney, and I'll try to summarize that as well.
Wait, so before I do that, Tobias has his hand up, and he might actually want to address Paola.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, just very briefly. I also wrote it in reply. So the data I use are basically hand coded based on qualitative evidence for the cases in the book I'm writing, and it took me more than a year to get it for 36 cases. So I think it's nothing you can use for these cross-case quantitative stuff. The only thing I thought about would be something to figure out perhaps where the rebel constituencies live, and then see whether specifically these areas are affected by the drought. I think von Uxküll and all did something similar in their 2016 paper, or whether you can find out where the government collects most of the tax revenues and see whether these areas are particularly drought impacted, and use that as a proxy. That's what I can think of, but just like spontaneously without checking whether this is possible. And thanks for the great presentations to all of you.
Thank you too. Okay, so no more hands. Then some questions for Sidney from Michael. Did you consider HDI as an index instead of additional GDP measures to integrate socioeconomic and human development? Would seem more comprehensive, or the Gini to reflect inequalities? Then from Silata, I'm sorry, is there a lag leading effect between extreme events and other factors such as economic, socioeconomic and governance? I assume that's for Sidney as well. And does response to extreme events by government and intern community feature in your model maybe have immediate effects on possible conflict both ways? And then from Marie, and I know you also responded to this, Sidney, but maybe you can recap. I have a question on subnational granularity on your input data, which we tried to solve as well in Strata, UNEP, New Climate Security Analytic Tool. If I remember correctly, World Bank Governance Indicator and the IDMC displacement data are at national scale. How do you use them at a subnational scale? Or what are your thoughts on better subnational data for governance and mobility indicators that are more difficult for monitoring quantitatively? Wow. Go ahead, Sidney.
Right, so the HDI to GDP question, in this project, I have just GDP. I think it actually is slightly better data at the subnational level, but HDI is perfectly fine. Like sort of, I imagine if I tossed it in there, it would do about the same thing. In fact, I know about that because I did it for the next sort of, when I'm working on a project that's similar to this, but interested in causal analysis. And essentially I put in the subnational human development index, and it's nice to have. But at the end of the day, sort of our results show that socioeconomic indicators contain a whole lot of information, which is what we expected. So having better predictions on that would be interesting if what I was looking at was the power of socioeconomic indicators, but I'm really interested in these extreme weather events. And so having good enough socioeconomic data to show what that prediction does tends to be good enough in this case. Ginies to reflect inequality. I have thought about sort of, particularly for future projects, inequality measures. Right now, that tends to look like sort of ethnic inequality data, which is what it is, or sort of excluded ethnic groups data. I guess we could pull either Gini data, which is at the national level, the best would probably come from the World Inequality Lab. And I know how they make that data, which is probably the best you can get. So I could think about adding it in. It would be at the national level, and they would just push it down to the subnational level, which could be useful. Another thing that might work is I have something like nightlight data or other sort of proxy data, and you could sort of integrate sort of percentage of subnational, sort of each sort of region's percentage, subnational GDP or human development as a percentage of overall nationwide as a proxy for sort of regional inequality. I mean, there are definitely things that can be done here. Is there a lag leading effect between extreme events and something like socioeconomic and governance? On a theoretical level and a reality level, yes. Is there a huge effect on sort of what we observe in our data? No, right? This is the constant sort of source of tension, and I just don't generally believe that you have a tropical cyclone in your GDP at a national level, or your measured GDP comes down well. Generally speaking, it's quite difficult to, this data isn't that good for us to see this. And there's a related question here. I think someone asked about sort of governance responses to extreme weather events. And I think that this actually captures something theoretical about our results. Is what we're looking at is, are the extreme weather events themselves actually useful predictors of conflicts? And if they are only useful predictors of conflict, or sort of they only lead to conflict in places that are badly governed, and those places that are badly governed also have conflicts for sort of other reasons, then in and of themselves, they're not actually adding any new information. So yes, do I believe that if you manage sort of a tropical cyclone by sending in the troops because that's the only thing you know how to do, this does actually describe places that don't know how to do anything else, or where the people in charge, this is how they think about things. Yeah, that might lead to more conflict, but sort of then the underlying problem, and the problem that apparently shows up in my predictive data, is that this is the type of governance or power structure going on. So we're trying to actually see whether knowing about these events themselves is increasing our knowledge. And that, generally speaking, just turns out not to be the case, which probably indicates that if whatever relationship between these two there is sitting mainly on the governance side. And then all of a sudden the chat is exploding. Is that for Paola, for me? Who's next?
So I think there's a question for Paola, which I skipped, from Kim. Drought is a slow on disaster. Do you have a similar example pertaining to rapid onset disasters such as flood or cyclones? And then there's also a question for the panel as such. Any thoughts on how to disaggregate the evidence base in terms of various conflict types, internal conflict, communal conflicts, human-wildlife conflict, as well as other violence, including gender-based violence? So Paola, why don't you take the first part, and then anyone who would like to take a stab at the rest?
Sure, thanks. Sorry, I also skipped this question. That wasn't intentional. My apologies. I don't include these measures in this paper specifically. I am including climate extremes and the whole list of climate extreme indicators that is officially recognized by climate scientists. So it's a pool of 36 climate indices in future work. So this includes also more rapid onset events like heat waves and so on. I don't have any results yet. A partial overlapping with your suggestion, though, comes from the fact that I include different timescales of SPEI, as I mentioned. So they capture also a shorter term impact. And SPEI-1, for example, has been combined with the information on the agricultural, on the main crops growing season. So in a way, it captures more of a the short-term impact, although I agree that droughts is a slower onset event. Thanks.
Okay, anyone want to take a stab at the second part of the questions about various conflict types? Oh, okay. We're running out of time, but I think we can. There are a couple of questions for the panel as such. Let me see. How recent new are these tools, and how long have panelists been able to operationalize these for? Did you have time to assess the prediction accuracy for these tools? Putting simply, have you been able to predict violence eruption already? Thanks. So I guess that's a very overall question about forecasting and prediction. Any thoughts on that?
I would. This is something that I cut out at the end of my presentation because it's purely speculative and it's not something I had time for. But I understand that sort of there are people who are working on people have been working on, I mentioned this in my presentation, the prediction of sort of conflict and violence is a central aim of this research agenda for generations. However, I think that there are real questions about sort of the usefulness, the accuracy, and the wisdom of focusing primarily on building a model that will tell you when conflict occurs in the future. You have, of course, as you get better and better, you come to feedback problems, but it doesn't tell you much about why a conflict is happening, and which is why sort of, in at least my presentation, I'm not focused much on the overall predictive power of my model as much as it is I want to know sort of what is helping me forecast. So while it is theoretically possible to sort of keep looking into how good our models are and try our best to sort of build models that are essentially just projections of the future, I think that raises some really important philosophical questions that I'm not sure make that exercise desirable, if that makes sense. Yeah, I'll yield if someone else wants to say something about that.
Yeah, we have 1 minute if someone has something they want to add on to that question, or any other questions in the chat.
I mean, I maybe just quickly, I think that is a really good point that Sidney makes. And I mean, we're working a lot with policymakers who always ask us this question. It's like kind of like, where are the areas most risk, and like, where should we put? And in the end, it's like, it's a question, where should we put our money and attention to? And I mean, I think it is really important to underline that our models kind of like on the quantitative are not good enough to do this. The question is, are we good enough on the qualitative side to do it? And I think we're also not good enough on the qualitative side to do this. Like, so it is really a very, very complex and hard problem. And in this absence, I think, of course, we need analysis, and we need to kind of like try to identify areas at risk, but we tend to end up at the history of conflict of like predicting that conflict will arise where conflict already is. And that often takes the attention away from other problems or other countries. I mean, thinking about Syria and Libya, those are kind of two countries that people didn't really expect to collapse that quickly, and they did. And kind of like just basing our analysis on this kind of history and conflict on this past data doesn't really help us. It's more kind of like what I find more helpful is this focus on why, like to really understand why certain conflicts erupt and under which conditions, and why and under which conditions does climate change contribute to that, because that helps us to kind of to prevent conflict in the sense of like, if we think an area is at risk, we can invest in it and kind of like say we try to break those pathways. It helps us to address conflicts that have already erupted, and it also kind of helps us to then have discussions with policymakers around where to focus attention on.
Okay, thank you. That unfortunately has to be the last comment of our conversation. I think we could have spent much more time on. Thank you to all the panelists. I think this has been a great session, and to all the questions. And based on the fact that there are questions in the chat that we haven't answered, I think speaks for the importance of this issue. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of the day and conference. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.